first crack appeared at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in October. Henrik Voss had been working the night shift on the Rotterdam Central Station renovation project for 6 months. But he'd never heard concrete make a sound like that before, a low, hollow groan that seemed to echo from somewhere deep beneath the station floor. He paused his jackhammer and wiped the sweat from his forehead, listening to the strange silence that followed. The other workers had gone on break, leaving him alone in the partially demolished section of the old platform. The fluorescent work lights cast harsh shadows across the rubble-strewn ground, and Henrik couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him from the darkness beyond their reach. When he resumed drilling, the concrete crumbled away more easily than it should have, revealing a gap that breathed cold, stale air against his face. He called out to his supervisor, but his voice seemed to disappear into the void behind the wall. Supervisor Dirk Bakker arrived with the morning crew to find Henrik sitting motionless on a pile of concrete blocks, staring at the hole in the wall. The gap had widened overnight, or so it seemed. Henrik insisted he hadn't touched it since calling Bakker, but the opening was now large enough for a man to crawl through. "There's something behind there," Henrik kept repeating, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something that shouldn't be there." Bakker shone his flashlight into the opening and saw nothing but darkness that seemed to swallow the beam hole. The project blueprints showed solid earth beyond that wall, but blueprints could be wrong. Old buildings held secrets, especially in a city that had been bombed to rubble and rebuilt from the ground up. But when Bakker reached his hand into the opening, the air that touched his fingers was unnaturally cold, and he could swear he heard something that sounded almost like whispers echoing from the depths. The decision to investigate came from above. Project manager Ernst de Witt received a call from the city planning office demanding immediate exploration of the discovered space. Could be structural issues, they said, could be archaeological significance. But de Witt suspected there was more to it when the caller's voice carried an undertone of urgency that didn't match the official language. 3 workers were selected for the initial reconnaissance. Henrik, because he'd found it; Martin, the team's most experienced urban explorer; and Lisa, their safety inspector, who doubled as a photographer for documentation. They squeezed through the opening one by one, their headlamps cutting through air that tasted of rust and decay. Beyond the concrete wall lay a tunnel, perfectly preserved, lined with ceramic tiles that gleamed dully in their lights. The ceiling curved in an arch typical of 1940s construction, and along the walls ran pipes and electrical conduits that disappeared into the darkness ahead and behind them. This wasn't just empty space. This was infrastructure, built with purpose and hidden with intent. The tunnel stretched in both directions, further than their lights could reach. The tiles were white, or had been once. Now they bore the brownish stains of decades, and the occasional darker mark that Lisa preferred not to think about too closely. Martin ran his fingers along the wall and found Maker's marks in German, dates from 1943 pressed into the ceramic. "This is wartime construction," he announced, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. Nazi era. They chose to go left first, following the gentle downward slope. Every 50 meters, they passed steel doors set into the walls, some sealed with thick bolts, others standing slightly ajar. The first open door revealed a small chamber lined with wooden shelves, empty now, but bearing the outline stains of whatever had once been stored there. The second room contained filing cabinets, their metal drawers pulled open and contents long gone. But in the third room, Lisa's camera flash illuminated something that made them all step back. Hospital gurneys, still equipped with leather restraints, arranged in neat rows, as if waiting for patients who would never come. They should have turned back then. Lisa would replay that moment in her mind for months afterward, the moment when they stood at the threshold of the room, full of gurneys, and felt the weight of history pressing down on them like a physical presence. But curiosity, that fatal human flaw, drove them deeper. The tunnel system was vast, branching into secondary passages that connected to larger chambers. Some rooms contained remnants of laboratories, broken glassware, chemical stains on concrete floors, ventilation systems that still hummed faintly with residual power. In one lab, Martin found journals written in German script, their pages brittle with age, but still legible. The entries spoke of experiments, of subjects who arrived in trains that came in the night, of research into consciousness transference and spiritual manipulation. Henrik discovered a room filled with nothing but mirrors, dozens of them mounted on every surface, reflecting their lights back in a dizzying kaleidoscope that made him nauseous. But it was Lisa who found the worst room, the one that explained why these tunnels had been sealed. The room Lisa discovered was different from the others. Larger, with a higher ceiling that disappeared into shadow above their lights. It contained what could only be described as an altar, a circular stone platform raised 3 steps above the floor, carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. The symbols seemed to shift and writhe in their peripheral vision, forming patterns that suggested meaning just beyond comprehension. Around the altar's perimeter, chains hung from iron rings set into the stone, and dark stains covered the platform's surface. But what made Lisa call out in horror wasn't the altar itself, it was what surrounded it. Dozens of chairs arranged in concentric circles, each one occupied by a figure in a gray uniform. The SS officers sat in perfect formation, their faces peaceful as if merely sleeping. But their bodies had long since mummified in the underground air. Some still wore their medals and insignia, others had skeletal hands folded neatly in their laps. At the center, facing the altar from an ornate chair, sat a figure in a black uniform, whose silver skull insignia gleamed in their flashlight beams. Henrik was the first to break. The sight of the perfectly arranged dead, sitting in eternal vigil around their occult altar, triggered something primal in his mind. He turned and ran, his footsteps echoing through the tunnel system as he fled toward the opening they'd entered through. Martin started after him, but Lisa grabbed his arm. "Wait," she whispered, though she couldn't explain why keeping quiet seemed important. Something about the scene demanded reverence, or perhaps fear. The figures in the chairs hadn't been placed there after death. They had died in position, as if participating in some final ceremony. Lisa raised her camera and began taking pictures, the flash illuminating details that their headlamps had missed. The altar wasn't just stained with blood, it was burned, as if subjected to intense heat from within. The symbols carved into its surface were deeper near the center, and some appeared to have been filled with a dark substance that had long since hardened. When she photographed the man in black, something in his posture made her step closer, despite every instinct screaming at her to flee. The man in black wasn't quite dead. Lisa realized this with a horror that froze her blood when she saw his chest rise and fall with the faintest suggestion of breath. His skin had the waxy quality of the others, but underneath it, something still moved. When she leaned closer, his eyes opened, not the clouded eyes of a corpse, but clear, aware, and filled with an intelligence that had been watching and waiting for 77 years. His lips moved soundlessly at first, then formed words in accented English. "You should not have come." Martin pulled Lisa backward as the figure in the chair began to shift, his joints creaking like old wood, but moving with deliberate purpose. Around the chamber, other figures began to stir, not all of them, but enough. The ones who had been closest to the altar, the ones whose uniforms bore the highest ranks, started to turn their heads toward the living intruders. Lisa's camera captured one final image before they ran. The man in black rising from his chair, his shadow falling across the symbol-covered altar where something was beginning to glow with a cold, blue light. They ran through the tunnel system in blind panic, their lights bouncing wildly off the ceramic walls as footsteps that weren't their own echoed behind them. Henrik had made it back to the opening and was already calling for help when Lisa and Martin burst through, gasping and covered in the cold sweat of absolute terror. They tried to explain what they'd seen, but the words sounded insane, even to their own ears. How do you tell someone that Nazis from World War II are still alive in tunnels beneath the city? That they've been waiting in some kind of occult stasis for nearly 8 decades. Supervisor Backer made the decision to seal the opening immediately. But as workers began mixing emergency concrete, they could hear sounds from within the tunnel. Footsteps, then voices speaking in German, then something else, a humming or chanting that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. The concrete was barely dry when the first cracks appeared in it, thin lines that spiderwebbed outward from the center, as if something was pressing against it from the other side. The emergency response came swiftly, too swiftly, as if the authorities had been expecting this call. Men in suits arrived before the police, speaking Dutch with government accents and carrying equipment that suggested they knew exactly what they were dealing with. They evacuated the construction site within an hour, citing structural instability and potential gas leaks. The workers were separated and interviewed individually, their stories recorded, but never officially documented. Henrik was offered early retirement with a generous pension if he agreed to sign a non-disclosure agreement. Lisa's camera was confiscated, her memory cards wiped, but she had already uploaded the photos to a cloud service that the officials never thought to check. By evening, the entire section of the station was cordoned off, and by morning, new concrete, much thicker than before, had been poured over the original seal. But something had changed in the renovation crew. Something had followed them out of those tunnels, invisible but present, watching them in their sleep and whispering in their dreams. The dreams began 3 days after the sealing. Henrik was the first to experience them, visions of the chamber with its circle of chairs. But now all the figures were standing, their faces turned toward him with expressions of patient hunger. In his dreams, the man in black spoke to him in perfect Dutch, explaining the great work they had been conducting, the experiments in consciousness that had nearly reached fruition when the war ended. "We were so close," the figure would say, "so close to transcending the limitations of flesh, to achieving true immortality of spirit. You have given us the key to continue." Henrik would wake screaming, but the dreams grew stronger each night. Soon, Martin began having similar visions, and then Lisa. The dead Nazis weren't just dreaming to them, they were teaching them, showing them the symbols from the altar, explaining their meaning and power. Lisa tried to research the symbols online, but found only fragments, references to pre-Christian Germanic mysticism, to Norse concepts of death and rebirth, to experiments conducted by the Unearthing. Lisa's research revealed the truth that the Dutch government had buried in 1946. The tunnels beneath Rotterdam weren't just bunkers. They were the site of Unearthing experiments into what they called Seelenübertragung, soul transference, led by an SS Oberfuhrer named Klaus Dietrich. A team of occultists and scientists had been working to preserve consciousness beyond physical death, to create an army of the dead that could serve the Reich for eternity. The experiments had used both willing SS volunteers and unwilling subjects brought from camps across occupied Europe. According to classified documents that Lisa found through her journalist contacts, the ritual had been nearly complete when Allied forces closed in on Rotterdam in 1945. Rather than flee, Dietrich and his closest followers had decided to complete their great work, performing the final ceremony that would bind their souls to the earth itself. waiting for the day when they could return to continue their research. The Dutch resistance had discovered the site in early 1946, but instead of destroying it, the government had chosen to seal it, believing that some knowledge was too dangerous to risk releasing into the world. The first physical manifestation occurred 2 weeks after the sealing. Lisa had been working late in her apartment, trying to decode more of the symbols she'd photographed, when her coffee mug began to rattle against her desk. The tremor was subtle at first, like a truck passing on the street below, but it grew stronger and more rhythmic, like a heartbeat pulsing through the building's foundation. Then the lights began to flicker, and in the intermittent darkness, she saw shapes moving in her peripheral vision, tall figures in military uniforms that vanished whenever she turned to look directly at them. Her laptop screen displayed text she hadn't typed, coordinates that, when she checked them, led to locations across Rotterdam where the tunnel system might extend. The manifestations weren't random. They were purposeful, organized, as if the dead were conducting reconnaissance through their unwilling connections to the living. When Lisa tried to leave her apartment, she found the door wouldn't open, though the lock turned freely. She was trapped until dawn, when the phenomena ceased as suddenly as they had begun. Henrik was found dead in his apartment on a Thursday morning, sitting at his kitchen table with his eyes wide open and a peaceful expression on his face. The coroner found no cause of death. His heart had simply stopped, as if he had decided to cease living. But Lisa knew better when she saw the photographs the police released. Henrik's hands were positioned exactly as those of the dead SS officers in the tunnel, folded neatly in his lap. And on the table before him, he had carved symbols into the wood with a kitchen knife, the same symbols from the altar. Martin disappeared 3 days later, leaving behind only a note written in his own handwriting, but using German phrases he had never learned. The note spoke of joining the great work and achieving consciousness beyond flesh. Lisa realized that the dead weren't just influencing their dreams, they were recruiting them, one by one, adding their life force to whatever ritual they were conducting from their sealed tomb. She made the decision to return to the tunnel, to find a way to stop what was happening before more people died. Getting back into the sealed area required help from someone inside the government response team. Lisa contacted Dr. Willem van der Berg, a historian she'd worked with on previous articles, who had connections to the Ministry of Defense archives. Van der Berg had been researching the Rotterdam incident independently and revealed that this wasn't the first time the seals had been broken. There had been incidents in 1963, 1978, and 1995, all quickly covered up, all resulting in similar disappearances and deaths. Each time, the government had increased the security around the site, but each time, the dead had found a way to influence the living world. They're getting stronger, Van der Berg explained as they prepared to enter the restricted zone. Each contact with the outside world feeds them more power. If we don't stop this now, they'll eventually be strong enough to break free entirely. They accessed the tunnel through a maintenance shaft 3 blocks from the station. Following schematics that Van der Berg had obtained through classified channels, the tunnels had grown since Lisa's first visit. New passages that shouldn't exist, carved from solid earth, as if the dead had been expanding their domain. The chamber had changed. Where once there had been empty chairs arranged around the altar, now living people sat in perfect formation. The missing construction workers, city officials, anyone who had been exposed to the tunnel's influence. They sat with the same peaceful expressions as the dead, but their chests rose and fell with shallow breathing. At the altar's center, the man in black Oberfuhrer Dietrich stood with his arms raised, conducting some kind of ritual that made the very air vibrate with malevolent energy. The symbols on the altar glowed brighter than before, and above it, something was taking shape, a swirling darkness that suggested presence without form, consciousness without flesh. "You are just in time to witness our triumph," Dietrich announced without turning around. 77 years of preparation, and now we achieve what the Reich only dreamed of: immortal consciousness, freed from the weakness of mortal flesh. Your friends have volunteered to be our vessels in the modern world. The living people in the chairs began to stand in unison, their movements synchronized as if controlled by a single will. Van der Berg had come prepared with more than just historical knowledge. From his coat, he produced thermite charges and a device that looked like a cross between a radio and a metal detector. "Electromagnetic pulse generator," he explained quickly. "The theory is that their consciousness transfer relies on electromagnetic fields generated by the ritual circle. Disrupt the fields, break the connection." As the entranced victims began to move toward them with slow, purposeful steps, Van der Berg activated the device. The effect was immediate. The glowing symbols flickered and dimmed, and several of the living victims stumbled as if suddenly awakened from a dream. But Dietrich only laughed. "You understand so little about what we have achieved. We are beyond your modern science now, beyond the physical laws that constrain your small minds." The darkness above the altar began to descend, reaching tendrils of nothingness toward the confused victims who were trying to remember where they were. Lisa realized that the EMP had only disrupted the lighter forms of control. The deeper ritual was still active, still drawing power from decades of accumulated spiritual energy. The solution came from Lisa's photographs, the images she had taken during their first exploration that showed the ritual chamber in its original state. In the photos, she could see details that had been missed in person. The symbols on the altar weren't just carved into the stone. They were inlaid with metal that formed a complex circuit. The entire altar was essentially a massive technological device, using principles that combined Nazi engineering with occult knowledge. If they could disrupt the circuit at its central point, the whole system might collapse. While Van der Berg used the thermite to create a barrier between them and the controlled victims, Lisa made her way toward the altar where Dietrich waited. "You cannot stop what has already begun," he told her with supreme confidence. "I have spent 77 years perfecting this moment. Death cannot touch me now. I am become eternal." But Lisa had noticed something else in her photographs, a small switch hidden beneath the altar's base, probably installed as a safety measure by the original engineers. As the dark presence above them grew stronger, and the controlled victims pressed against Van der Berg's fire barrier, Lisa dove beneath the altar and found the switch. When Lisa triggered the hidden switch, the effect was catastrophic and immediate. The altar's glow died instantly, and the swirling darkness above collapsed in on itself with a sound like reality tearing. Dietrich screamed not in pain, but in fury and disbelief, as 77 years of careful preparation unraveled in seconds. The other SS officers, the ones who had been sitting in eternal vigil, began to crumble like ancient paper touched by flame. The living victims collapsed unconscious, but breathing, their connection to the ritual severed. But Dietrich himself didn't crumble. Instead, he began to change, his preserved flesh becoming translucent as the consciousness that had sustained him for so long started to fade. "This is not over," he whispered, his voice becoming hollow and distant. "We have touched eternity. Others will continue our work. The knowledge will spread." As his form dissolved into mist, Lisa saw something in his eyes that chilled her more than anything she had witnessed. Not defeat, but satisfaction, as if this outcome was still part of some larger plan. 6 months later, Rotterdam Central Station opened its new renovation to great fanfare, with no mention of the discoveries made during construction. The workers who had survived were relocated to different projects across the country, their silence bought with generous settlements, and the implied threat of charges for violating state security. Van der Berg returned to his academic post, but his research now focused on other sites across Europe where similar experiments might have taken place. Lisa kept writing, but her articles now dealt with different subjects. She had learned that some stories were too dangerous to tell in full, yet she kept the one photograph that had survived the government confiscation, the image of Dietrich rising from his chair with those intelligent, aware eyes. Sometimes, late at night in her new apartment, she would stare at that photograph and notice details she hadn't seen before, shadows in the background that might be other figures, symbols carved into surfaces that weren't part of the original altar. The tunnel beneath Rotterdam had been filled with concrete and steel, sealed more thoroughly than ever before. But Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that sealing something away wasn't the same as destroying it. And sometimes, when the wind was right and the city was quiet, she thought she could hear something humming beneath the streets, patient and eternal, waiting for the next curious workers to break through the next wall.